Yep.
Okay. So anything I've forgotten to tell people, Yoav, before we start?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. So so Philip's going to talk for about an hour. There'll be plenty of opportunity for questions. And what we'll do is to make it more personal. As I say, if you send me the questions on the chat, but I'll then invite you to unmute and turn your video on, and you and Phil can have a bit of a dialogue. Okay, but over to Phil.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me all right? Good. Very nice to see you. It's I know that we'd all like to be together in a space, but there is something quite weird and wonderful about all these little tiny boxes, everyone's little slice of life that you can see going on, and people moving around and smiling and doing all sorts. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk. It's very nice to be here virtually with you, to be meeting in cyberspace. I'm going to talk about klezmer music. I'm going to talk about the history of klezmer music and then bring it up to date with some idea of where klezmer music sits in the contemporary musical world and also within my own musical practice. So we'll get onto that as we go. I'm not sure what the appropriate greeting for Yom HaShoah is. I'm not sure there is one, but I guess maybe talking about an aspect of Jewish culture, a large part of which was silenced by the Holocaust, is maybe an appropriate way to think about today. So we can kind of bear that in mind as we're going through. As David said, I'm going to talk for about an hour. If I haven't been clear about something or you've missed something which you feel is important, please, stick your hand up and I can go over something again. If you have a question or you want to argue the toss, then leave that to the end and we can have a discussion about that. I was probably supposed to be down in Bristol at least twice since David asked me to come and talk, but obviously because of pandemic time, it keeps getting moved further and further on. But with luck, I will be down at St. George's with my band Moishe's Bagel in September. So possibly see some of you then. Fingers crossed. Okay, I'm going to start by playing a bit of music. I'm going to start by playing two tunes. The accordion doesn't zoom particularly brilliantly, but if you close your eyes or maybe imagine it's an old record or something like that, then we can forgive the dodgy sound quality. So I'm going to play a Dobry Dzień, which is a good morning tune, and then I'm going to play a Skocznia, which is a fairly lively dance tune and would often have been played as part of a kind of listening element in the wedding. So not so much necessarily for dancing, but perhaps for a show-off fiddle playing band leader to do his thing. Here we go. I'll move this screen down a bit so you can see that I am actually playing. Thank you. It's nice to start off with a bit of music. It's funny, you know, you talk about music and sometimes you forget that music is actually the thing, not the talking. So those two tunes, it's kind of interesting to think about those two tunes to set a little bit of a context about what I'm going to say. They come from two collections. I will show you the books, actually, the collections they come from. These are modern editions. The first tune I played is from a book which is now published as The Ultimate Klezmer. It was originally published in 1916 in Brooklyn by two brothers, the Kostakowski brothers, Nat and Wolf Kostakowski. Wolf was a fiddle player and Nat was the publisher. And it was published under the very snappy title, International Hebrew Wedding Music. And why did they need a book? These were all musicians who could play all these tunes, had all these tunes in their heads. Why did they need a book? The answer is, by 1916 in America, they needed a book because there were people on the bandstand who hadn't grown up with this music, who didn't know the tunes. And so they needed some dots. They needed, you know, a fake book, essentially, a crib sheet, so that they could stand on the bandstand with the klezmer musicians and would be able to get through the tunes. So even by 1916, very early on in this story, really, we're seeing klezmer music expand outwards from you know, the putative imaginary shtetl outwards into society. The second tune was collected by a Ukrainian Jewish ethnomusicologist called Moishe Beregovsky, probably the most important person in Jewish music studies, certainly the most important pre-war person in Jewish music studies, and still one of the most important in Eastern European Jewish music studies. And Beregovsky in the 1930s was aware that this was a tradition which was disappearing. It was a tradition which was disappearing. This is before the Holocaust. This is at the beginning of the Stalin era, so he was aware of that, and Beregovsky himself fell foul of Stalin and ended up being imprisoned. But it wasn't even so much of that. He was aware the tradition was disappearing because of urbanization. Jews were moving from the shtetls, from the smaller market towns and villages to the city, where inevitably life was more heterogeneous, life was subject to far more different kind of influences, and it was harder to keep a single tradition like the klezmer tradition going. He was also aware that in the 20th century, with kind of modernization generally, that older traditions of Jewish life were disappearing. So Beregovsky was one of a number of people who collected not just music, but folklore, art, craft, these kinds of things. So those two tunes, you can hear they're cracking tunes still now. You know, they don't sound historical. They sound like great pieces of music, which is what they are. But those two tunes, the historical context for them sets an interesting frame around what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen now. There's quite a lot of slides. I'll go through these slides. This is a presentation I've given in various forms in different places and in different ways. So I might skip around a little bit through these slides. There's quite a lot of music as well to keep us going. I'm going to share my screen now, and remember to share the sound. Right, okay. And then if I start from the beginning, okay, who can I see? I can see Jeff and actually just Jeff. Could you just give me a nod that you can see this? Thank you very much. Right, okay. This is kind of a cross-section of what klezmer music looks like, has looked like, and continues to look like. Let's see who we've got here. Move that Zoom control box out the way a little bit. So the most historical image we've got is down here in the bottom left. This is a klezmer kapelle from Berdichev in Ukraine. And then we have a revival band up here top, Capella. This is an American revival band from the 1970s, featuring people who are still active and some of whom will figure in our story. And then more recently, we have the kind of multicolored diversity that klezmer has become. So up here in the top left, this is the Knoblauch klezmer band from Berlin. In the middle here, either side of the Trabant, I think it's a Trabant, is the Amsterdam klezmer band. Just to the left of them is the Isle of Klesbos from New York. Down here on the bottom left is Shikoyach, a great London klezmer band. We also have some imagery which we see reappear within klezmer music. These three wild-haired fellas here, they pretty much look like if you do a Google search of klezmer musicians, you get a lot of things that look a bit like this, or sometimes they will look a bit more Hasidic, but generally the idea of the kind of crazy wandering musician. And then above these three klezmer musicians, we have a kind of piece of almost stained glass art, which is very much pointing to the idea of the connection between klezmer music as secular ritual music and a certain sort of spirituality within the music. So there's a little sort of a little sampling of what klezmer has looked like in the past and looks like today. Now, there's a difference, though, between the past and today. Today's klezmer musicians are part of what we understand as world music. And world music nowadays is big business. It's what I've called an industrial complex with commercial structures and global reach. It's music which is disseminated through festivals, through magazines like Songlines, through record labels, through radio stations, and so on. It is transnational and it's internationalized, and everyone is putting their videos on YouTube and giving talks like this around the world. And that's the kind of world that klezmer music exists in today. Historically, klezmer music is in a very different sort of place. Historically, we see the klezmer musician as a non-religious, in other words, he's not a rabbi, but he's a coordinator of Jewish life cycle events. The klezmer musician in Eastern European weddings was the main person making the things happen. The different music that the klezmer musicians played signified different moments throughout a ceremony, throughout a celebration, which could often last up to a week. The klezmer was a professional musician for hire. In that sense, it's a similar thing to today. Historically, the klezmer musician has existed at the edges of society. And in fact, no, I don't have it to hand. There's a very nice passage from a novel by Sholem Aleichem, who wrote The Fiddler on the Roof, wrote the, Anatevka, Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye the Milkman Tales, in a book that he wrote called Stempenu, which is based on a real life klezmer musician. And this kind of describes very nicely how the klezmer musician historically was viewed as a sort of mythical, almost mythical figure in terms of his ability to connect to people through his music, but was also slightly kind of scary, slightly untrustworthy. It's actually something we still see today. Everyone loves a musician, but they wouldn't want their kids to marry one. That was true. That was true then, and it's still true now. And in a sense, this is part of an idea of a klezmer musician as what I've called a liminal, interstitial figure between the religious and the secular, someone who themselves was not religious. In fact, historically, klezmer musicians in the towns and villages and cities where they function were often derided for their lack of knowledge of Torah and Talmud and things. And yet they were crucial in maintaining religious community values in terms of weddings and other life stage events. So we have a difference between historical klezmer and contemporary klezmer. You'll notice I'm saying he a lot. That's not because I'm unaware. That's because klezmer musicians historically were all male. Luckily, this is changing, but it's taken some time. And in the period where our story starts, they were all men, which is why I'm saying he. So where are we talking? Well, klezmer musician, for want of a better definition, is the traditional instrumental music of Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. And that means Jews largely, not exclusively, but largely in the Pale of Settlement, which if you look at the map on the left, is this kind of loose rectangle of land, which goes from the Baltic states up in the north, down through Poland, through Romania, down to the Black Sea, and then back up the other side. And it's an area that was originally Poland, Congress Poland, and then when Catherine the Great came to power in 1789, I think it was, this land came under the dominion of Russia. Catherine the Great wasn't really sure what to do with all these Jews, and so she stuck them in a loosely bordered area, which became known as the Pale of Settlement. Now, Jews were not exclusively confined to this area, and they could move about within it, and they could move out of it. It wasn't there wasn't a wall, but travel outside was difficult, definitely. If you were in the Pale of Settlement, the chances are you stayed in the Pale of Settlement. So, and at that, in the 19th century, that's the largest concentration of Jewish life. There's about 5 million Jews in this area, this area here. And so we have a real concentrated kind of hive of Jewish life in towns, in villages, and in cities. And this is where klezmer music, as we know it today, really develops. There were klezmer musicians before this time, and Jewish professional instrumental musicians have been in evidence since about the 17th century, but it's in the Pale of Settlement in the 19th century that it really developed. So let's hear the kind of thing that sounded like. Now, we haven't got records from the 19th century, but this is from the early 20th century. This is from a band called the Ukrainian State Ensemble of Jewish Folk Musicians, and they're playing a frelax, which is a lively dance. Here we go. Okay, I'm cutting that off just for time. You can hear some things which are very characteristic of klezmer music. There's certainly a slightly weird, very jagged instrumental style. This isn't like folk musicians playing jigs and reels. It doesn't have that lilt of a lot of folk music. That the way they were playing that melody, it's very kind of jerky, and that's a very kind of idiomatic klezmer style. You also hear lots of different people playing the same melody, not in exactly the same way. It's a bit like Eric Morecambe, you know, they're playing all the same notes, but not necessarily in exactly the same order. And that's what's known as heterophony, which is a very characteristic klezmer sound. So you get a very thick melodic texture. It's not like a symphony orchestra where you have 30 violins all playing the same line as closely as possible. A lot of the time in traditional klezmer music, you have people playing the same tune, but with their own individual, often idiosyncratic variations all mixed together in a way like early jazz music, like Dixieland jazz music. You hear a very driving rhythm there, and that is characteristic of a certain amount of klezmer music, but by no means all of it. And we're going to hear some different sort of stuff as we move on. Okay. It's useful to think about the word itself in telling this story. The word comes from two Hebrew words, clay, meaning kind of vessel or instrument, and zemer, song. You probably would have heard the word zemer. And you put them together, you get klezmer, 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 and that pushes together. And biblically, in biblical Hebrew, that means, in a roundabout way, an instrument of song, a singing instrument, in other words, a musical instrument. So the word klezmer, historically, before it referred to musicians, referred to musical instruments themselves. But the interesting thing about etymology is that it reflects and in some senses alters social need. And so by the 16th century, this is in Bohemia and Moravia, and then heading slightly further east as well, the word klezmer had begun to be used by Eastern European Jews to mean musicians. So this is the first time that klezmer starts to mean musicians, klezmer musicians. And this might indicate a change in the role from what were known as letzim or letzonim, which were kind of all-purpose jesters and entertainers in medieval and middle age. Oh, sorry, that's okay. Phone's ringing. Can you answer that? Okay, sorry. Just to prove we are live. Right, sorry about that. I hope you can hear me over the telephone ringing there. And it might indicate a move to slightly more formalized professional musicians. And what it specifically began to refer to in the 16th and 17th century onwards was a mostly hereditary group known as a capelier of male instrumentalists performing ritual and entertainment functions at weddings and other festivals. So this is where klezmer music, as we start to know it, becomes kind of, sorry, that telephone put me right off. This is where klezmer music, as we know it, starts to take shape. We have in the 18th, 19th centuries onwards, hereditary group of male instrumentalists who are performing for weddings and other sort of entertainment functions. Now, before the Second World War, the word klezmer almost exclusively referred to a musician. So there were very few examples of people talking about klezmer music. Now we talk about klezmer music. I say, I play klezmer music. What are you going to listen to? Oh, we're going to go and hear some klezmer music. What do? They do klezmer music. That's a more recent phenomenon. And after the Second World War, particularly in the States, where a number of klezmer musicians ended up, the word klezmer actually came to mean old-fashioned. It was like a kind of country bumpkin, you know, like a greenhorn, someone who was from the old country and, in other words, was a bit non-literate and a bit old-fashioned in their musical style and their musical tastes, as opposed to what became the more cosmopolitan and modern musicant. There are quotes from klezmer musicians of the early 19th century saying things like, you know, if you'd called me a klezmer after the war, I would have punched you, because that was a kind of insult. And then from the klezmer revival onwards, from the 1970s onwards, the word comes to mean a type of music, and particularly a recognized type of world music. So we have a changing etymology that reflects the changing relationship of klezmer or a klezmer musician or klezmer music to the society of which it's a part. This is what some of the klezmer musicians have looked like over the years. So we have a slightly kind of older bunch here. On the very top left is a man named Gusikov, who was from Belarus, and he played this strange instrument next to him, which was a sort of straw bale xylophone kind of thing, and apparently was amazing at it. And there are reports from Mendelssohn and Liszt coming to see his concerts and writing back to their friends and family saying how incredible he was. Underneath him is a man named Podotsa, who was a great fiddle player from Ukraine, 19th century fiddle player. Next to him is an image, I think, of a fiddle player called Stempenyu, which is the one that Sholem Aleichem wrote his book about. In fact, that's what that says above, Sholem Aleichem Stempenyu. Next to Stempenyu is a band leader called Abi Schwartz, who moved to the States and became a very successful Second Avenue band leader, and that's his daughter on piano. And then we move to the States. We're going to meet these two gentlemen with the clarinets a bit later on. On the left-hand side in the middle here is Naftali Brandwein, and next to him is Dave Taras. They form a kind of Beatles and Rolling Stones of klezmer music from the 1920s in the States onwards. On the left-hand side, preaching with his clarinet, is a man named Giora Feidman, who was from Argentina, and then moved to Israel in his teens and became a very influential revival klezmer musician, spreading a certain sort of universal liberal spirituality on the back of his klezmer music. And then down the bottom, we have three klezmer revival groups, Andy Statman and Zev Feldman on the left, the Klezmatics here, and Brave Old World, these four guys at the bottom, and we're going to meet all those later. You can see that with the exception of Abi Schwartz's daughter and Alicia Svigals from the Klezmatics, this is exclusively, so far, a male narrative. Oh, I don't think we need to hear them again. Actually, no, we could just hear. No, that's fine. I think we've heard enough so far. We'll move on. As we come into the late 20th and early 21st century, we see that, well, klezmer moves into Technicolor for a start, and then we see that the gender balance is redressed to a certain extent, and the outfits become more colorful, the poses slightly more idiosyncratic, and the image more front and center. So we've met some of these people before. That's the Amsterdam Klezmer Band in the middle, Isle of Klesbos at the top right. Down at the bottom right is the London Klezmer Quartet. And then next to them from Berlin is Daniel Kahn and the Painted Bird. We're going to meet some more of these people as we go on. In fact, I'll tell you what, let's hear a little bit of how klezmer has kind of come to be used nowadays in a club sort of context before we go back to our historical story. This is a remix of the Amsterdam Klezmer Band. Oh. So you can hear there klezmer music fitting very much into a contemporary kind of dance floor aesthetic, and at the same time lending a certain sort of Eastern exotica to that dance floor aesthetic. And that's very much one of the functions that it fulfills nowadays. Let's go back a bit. How might we define klezmer music? We've heard a few examples of it now. So at the moment, it's in that state of like, I know it when I hear it, but how could you kind of think about it in a slightly more formalized way? Well, here I'm going to draw on the work of a great klezmer musician and klezmer scholar called Joel Rubin. And he posits 5 elements at the intersection of which is what he calls klezmer music in the strictest sense. And this is historical still. This is still talking about a 19th and early 20th century definition of klezmer music. So we're talking about, as we said, a mostly hereditary socioeconomic group. In other words, klezmer musicians didn't kind of, you know, meet on the street and say, hey, let's form a klezmer band like might happen now. This was largely a family, a kind of dynastic process handed down from father to son. And the youngest son would normally begin their apprenticeship in the band on the drums, and then they might graduate through to the double bass, possibly a wind instrument, before eventually, if they were any good, picking up the fiddle and perhaps making band leader. So this was a kind of caste dynastic system. This is a group of musicians who perform a specific ritual function. So they're not just playing whatever anyone else wants or whatever they fancy. They're playing particular music for particular ritual events, most notably weddings. They're often an urban ensemble. I want to push back a little bit against this image of the wandering, you know, troubadour, romantic, wandering Jewish musician, because for klezmer musicians, it wasn't true. Most of them were sedentary, not meaning that they sat around on their couches all day, but they lived in one place and they went to play in other places, much in the way that me and any other musicians listening here, we might go on tour, not right now, of course, but we did, and hopefully we will again, go on tour and then come back to where we live and do some more gigs where we live and then go on tour or go and do, you know, a concert somewhere else and come back. That was the way that klezmer musicians also operated. And occasionally there are documented examples of one klezmer band turning up when there was a particularly wealthy wedding going on. The klezmer band of that shtetl might have been booked, and then another klezmer band would turn up on spec and say, well, we'd like to play this wedding because we're going to make some money. And that could occasionally result in fights. More often than not, it would result in one band being paid off. So, you know, you get paid for not playing the gig. Klezmer musicians played a certain body of instrumental repertoire. In other words, there were certain tunes which were considered klezmer music and certain tunes which weren't. Klezmer musicians might play a waltz, or they might play a tango, or they might play a foxtrot, but that wasn't considered klezmer music. Klezmer music was the sort of things we've been hearing so far, frelechs and bulgars and horrors and these kind of things. And we're going to meet some more of those sort of musical examples as we go on. And klezmer music is also defined by a set of performance styles, techniques, and performance practice, which is what we heard right at the beginning. So a particular way of playing, a particular melodic and instrumental texture, which marks out klezmer music. Now, the thing is, so much changes in the 20th century. Migration, not just for Jews, not just for klezmer musicians, but also for Jews and klezmer musicians. Migration, the Holocaust, assimilation, the 60s and 70s rise of identity politics, the rise of world music, as we've talked about a bit, and so on, make all these things different. In other words, we don't anymore see klezmer musicians all belonging to a hereditary socioeconomic group. It's very unusual to find a klezmer band which is all made up of one family through different generations. We do see some klezmer musicians performing a specific ritual function at weddings and things like that, but the vast majority not. Actually, the vast majority of klezmer musicians nowadays are playing concerts and festivals and this kind of thing. They are still urban and they're still largely performing on Western instruments. There is a body of instrumental repertoire still, but this has widened massively since the days of the people that you can see in these pictures. And there is still a set of performance styles and techniques and performance practice, but there are many people playing klezmer music now who don't necessarily pay much attention to these historical performance styles. So the idea, the banner of what is klezmer, if we can point to it historically, has now widened a great deal. Okay, I'm hoping that you're still with me and getting something from this as we go on. There's a bit about, I'm not going to talk about the Jewish wedding in Eastern Europe. I think we can come back to that if anyone would like to know. Let's hear another bit of music. I mentioned that a lot of klezmer music is characterized by a strong dance kind of sensibility. I don't mean contemporary dance music. I mean a rhythm that kind of makes you want to dance, and a rhythm that is designed to accompany dancing in the way that Keilim music is, in the way that lots and lots of music that performs ritual functions is designed for. But that's only one side of klezmer music. There was historically a large repertoire which was designed for listening, not for dancing. And perhaps the most impressive bit of this was what was known as a doinya or a taksim. That's an interchangeable sort of word in klezmer repertoire. The meaning is not necessarily the same, but both words were used. Taksim, in fact, comes from Middle Eastern and Turkish music originally. And this is an improvisation, not in the sense of a jazz improvisation, an improvisation that brings together lots of small themes. Any musicians amongst you who are watching will see lots of repeated fragments in this score, like here on the end of this first line, that kind of thing. So it's a small, it's a piece of music made up of the combination of lots of small repeated and varied fragments, and it's characterized by a free meter. So there's not a rhythm as such, not a recognizable pulse, but there is a large amount of soul and a large amount of kind of introspection. And this historically would often have been played at a wedding, perhaps just before the Bagel, who was the sort of wedding MC, would have addressed the bride and told her in quite penitential terms the life that she was going to lead. This was music that was designed to make listeners turn their thoughts inwards and kind of reflect. So maybe we could listen to a bit of this and listen to a bit of this reflection. This comes from the collection of Moishe Beregovsky, which is from the piece that I played right at the beginning. And this is played by the klezmer musician who gave us that definition, Joel Rubin. Just with that chord change, I'm going to and stop it there. You can hear really a lot of idiomatic, very characteristic ornamentation and phrasing going on there. And clearly this is music which is designed to elicit emotion, isn't it? This is not neutral music. This is highly emotionally charged music, highly emotionally charged playing. And that was the function of things like doinyas and taksims. And they were also, as you can hear, it's a real showpiece for the instrumentalist. So this is the klezmer soloist pushed front and center, very different from that sort of heterophonic, everybody all bundling in to play the tune music that we heard earlier. And so it's no surprise that this would often be played by the band leader. The most famous klezmer band leaders historically didn't play for the dancing at all. They turned up and played for the top table, you know, which is known as some tish. They played for the top table, picked up their fee, and then left the dance playing to their subordinates. And actually, I know a few band leaders where that's still the case. Okay, so this is where we're at in Eastern Europe. But as we know, the story doesn't stay in Eastern Europe. From the late 19th century, we see the effects of pogroms in Eastern Europe, restrictive laws. There was a little period of liberation under Alexander II, but with Alexander II's murder in 1883 and Alexander III becoming the Tsar, we see things getting much worse again for Russian Jews. And general economic hardship for many Jews in Eastern Europe. All of these things, allied to increasing kinship and social ties in the States and in Western Europe, we see all of these contexts leading to increased migration and urbanization of shtetl Jews in Eastern Europe. And they're going, where are they going? Well, they're coming here to the UK. That's the story for at least some of us listening here, tracing back our ancestors. Going to France, going to Germany a little bit. They're going to Palestine sometimes, South America, Australia, South Africa. But most of all, they're going to what was known as the Golden Medina, the golden land of the United States. And this is all types of Jews moving, but it's more often young Jews moving. I mean, young, if you're an established klezmer band leader in your 40s with a successful band and you're getting a lot of work, you're probably not very likely to pick up sticks and move across the Atlantic and try and start all over again. If you are a 19, 20-year-old clarinet virtuoso who's maybe feeling the market is a little bit crowded in, in Odessa or in Warsaw or anywhere nearby, then you're much more likely to head across the Atlantic and arrive in New York. So that's what happened here. This is lots of klezmer musicians were moving along with the waves of Jews who were migrating from east to west. And this is talking about 2.5 million Jews ending up in the States. It's a large amount, and a large amount went to South America as well. A smaller amount came here and elsewhere. And so musicians are part of this migration, and because they're part of this migration, the music that they're playing changes when it gets to the States. Why does it change? Well, it changes because of the context which is now in. This is now, let's say we're in New York in the 1920s. This is the jazz age. Now, klezmer wasn't massively influenced by jazz music, but it certainly was to a certain extent. So we see saxophones coming in, we see pianos coming in, we see drum sets rather than conventional marching drums, which were used in traditional klezmer music. Now, these changes were also taking place in Eastern Europe because there was a lot of dialogue between these two places. Prior to the Second World War, there was a lot of communication between Jewish Eastern Europe and Jewish America, but they happened most noticeably in the States. We see the arrival of new musical spaces, particularly in the States. In Eastern Europe, if you were well off and it was probably the father of the bride playing for the wedding. If you were well off and your daughter was getting married, then the party you threw or the wedding you threw could last a week. Now, no one in New York, no matter how much money they've got, can afford to throw a party for a week. And what would have been happening in the town square starts to happen in the catering hall. There starts to be shorter weddings. So what would have taken the space of a week starts to take the space of a day. We see the emergence of radio, the emergence of Yiddish theatre, and the emergence of new performance spaces in places like the Catskill Mountains, which was one of the resorts that American Jews went to. We see, particularly allied to the dissemination power of radio, we see the development of klezmer stars in the States, and we're going to look at two of them, Dave Terrace and Naftali Brandwein, very shortly. We see, as I mentioned at the beginning, the increased inclusion on the bandstand of non-capella musicians, in other words, musicians who were not part of this dynasty, who didn't always play klezmer music and didn't always play with the same people. And this is, for someone like me and any musicians listening, this is a very common thing. You have bands that are your band that you play with. There's also a large number of kind of musicians within your network that you might play with from time to time when you get called for the gig. And this starts to become the case with klezmer music in the States as well, which is why we then need things like this International Hebrew Wedding Music book that I pointed to at the beginning, because people need dots to read. They need the music to read because they don't know the tunes. And a lot of these musicians coming in are not Jews. They start to be lots of Greeks and Italians playing klezmer music with Jews on the bandstand, and likewise Jews starting to play for Greek audiences and for Italian audiences and so on. So an increased kind of cross-fertilization of ethnicities, which is inevitable really if you think about the concentration of life in somewhere like the Lower East Side. Obviously you had Jewish areas, you have Italian areas, you have Irish areas further up in New York, but there's no way those areas can remain completely independent of the influence of other nationalities and ethnicities in the way that perhaps they could in larger spread out areas in Eastern Europe. We see a broadening of musical style and arguably a dilution of what we might call klezmer, and we're going to look at that again in a second, and the disappearance of large parts of the wedding repertoire. I talked at the beginning about how klezmer musicians in Eastern Europe were responsible for structuring a wedding which could last up to a week. And so whatever they did, all the different types of music they played were intimately related to the different stages of the wedding. Now, if you have a week-long wedding which is suddenly squashed into 5 or 6 hours, there's not room for all that repertoire anymore. So a lot of that repertoire, historical, traditional Jewish wedding repertoire disappears. And we see the increased kind of fusion or cross-fertilization or overlap between Yiddish singers, who are from film stars as well, people like Molly Picon and Aaron Lebedev, with klezmer music, which was certainly not the case in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, klezmer music and Yiddish song they came from the same cultural world, but they were two very different spheres. And we might talk a bit more about that at the end. Okay, so this is the kind of effect which is going on when klezmer music moves to the United States. And we can contextualize this effect looking at two particular musicians, Dave Taras and Naftali Brandwein. Like I said, the kind of Beatles and the Rolling Stones is a terrible analogy, but you've got to find some way of talking about it, of klezmer music. Now, there were a lot of similarities between Taras and Brandwein. They were both from a similar part of Eastern Europe, although Taras was from Ukraine and Brandwein was from Galicia, but very close. They were both from klezmer kapeliers, so they both had yichis, they both had lineage in their kind of history. There was a difference in musical literacy, and the difference was quite specific. Dave Taras could read music and Naftali Brandwein couldn't. So the result was that Dave Taras, when he got to New York, was able to branch out in the music that he made and was able to disseminate his own music much wider because he could read music. He could write his own music down and he could read other people's music. So he made records for the Greek community, for example, because he could turn up and the band leader could say, here you go, here's a sheet, read it. The image is that Dave Taras was a kind of urbane professional and Brandwein was an unpredictable showman. Now, it's possible that these legends actually, it's not possible, it's very likely these legends get greatly exaggerated, but there apparently is some truth in this. And Dave Taras certainly was known as very elegant and professional and reliable, and Brandwein was unreliable. He was mercurial. He was liable to throw his clarinet at someone when they played the wrong note, these kind of things. Brandwein also was the favorite musician of Murder Incorporated, which was the Jewish gangsters of New York. He was a bit like Fats Waller was to Al Capone, Naftali Brandwein was to Meyer Lansky and all those kind of people. And like I said, so the result of this difference in personality, but also difference in literacy, was that Dave Taras was able to develop and expand his music, whereas Naftali Brandwein stayed the same. And Dave Taras was far more successful ultimately. He produced far more records and became much better known. Let's listen to a bit of these two. So we're going to listen to each of them, a little snippet from each of them. First of all, we'll hear Naftali Brandwein, and this is really, they might all sound quite similar these days because, you know, we're talking about differences within a music which makes up 0.0001% of the world's music. So we're talking about tiny differences really, but seeing as we're listening quite closely to klezmer music this evening, you may be able to pick out some differences. The first one is Naftali Brandwein playing, and you will hear a very kind of old world klezmer style, very jagged, kind of quirky almost style. It's cool, it's very funky, but it's very idiosyncratic. And then we'll hear Dave Taras. And when we hear Dave Taras, you will instantly, within the first phrase, hear a very clear nod to the fact that he is now in America. Okay, here's Brandwein first of all. Okay, and now let's hear a bit of Dave Terrace. And like I say, you'll hear New York straight away. So that style of Terrace's, I presume you heard the quote from Rhapsody in Blue right at the beginning there. That style of Terrace's really became symbolic of the sound of American klezmer, and it's very glitzy. It's great. It's very kind of, strutting down Second Avenue or even strutting down Fifth Avenue. It's got a real kind of New York showiness about it, which is very attractive. And while we're on Dave Terrace, I want to play you a little clip of him being interviewed when he was probably in his 80s or his 70s, talking about his early days in New York when he arrived as an immigrant. The film quality is very poor. Actually, well, the film quality is right. The sound quality is very poor. So you'll have to kind of listen hard. The one word I'll just give you, which is a bit hard to make out, is furrier, when he says he was a furrier, as in he made furs. That'll make sense as we watch this. Okay, so this is Dave Terrace interviewed in the 1980s when the klezmer revival, which is what we're going to talk about shortly, was starting to get underway.
Golden Land of us, the 1st of April 1921. I ran without anything from Russia. My brother-in-law had an uncle here. They accepted me very nicely. They said, we don't know anything about music. And then I myself thought that I wouldn't be good as a musician in America. He said, all I can do, I can take you, and he was a foreigner. You want to go work? I'll take you in. So I said, I'll do anything. I brought my wife here, and I have to make a living. One of the musicians from the society, he heard me play. They had a meeting in the society. And he started to tell him there is a Jewish boy, a greenhorn, plays terrific clarinet. They got me to play there. When I started to play, they surrounded me. The musicians, the better ones, and they all kind of surrounded me. Where you come from? You work in a factory? Says, well, I have to make a living. One guy came over and gave me 5 jobs. So I came to my brother-in-law. I still used to have with me the knife with the cut for. I gave him the knife. And I said, thank you very much. And that was the end of being a foreigner. I still have the card from the Foreigners Union. I never threw it away.
Oh, wonderful. I hope you got that. I'm happy to do a little bit of paraphrasing at the end if you missed the narrative. Okay. This takes us to the middle of the 20th century. What happens next? Well, what happens is the story that we see for Jewish populations in many parts of the Western world. Assimilation, the rise of Jewish middle classes, the move out of the Lower East Side to the Brooklyn or to Brooklyn or the Bronx, and later to the suburbs. These two pictures, this is the Lower East Side in 1900 on the left-hand side, and this is the Lower East Side 100 years later. You can see the difference. And with this comes a decline in spoken Yiddish. And this is something I probably won't get into too much in this talk, but the relationship between the Yiddish language and klezmer music is very strong and very important. And as you see a decline in spoken Yiddish, that often is indicating or leading to or reflecting a decline in the importance of klezmer music. Let's go on with the story. Meanwhile, what's happening in the old country? So we're seeing assimilation and the rise of Jewish middle classes in the States. Well, things aren't looking too good in the old country. Yeah, I don't need to go into too much detail, but we have the Holocaust, bringing with it large-scale destruction of Eastern European Jewish life. The Jewish communities that remain are inevitably fragile and inward-looking. And at the same time, after the Second World War, especially, you have the Soviet suppression of Jewish life and culture, which turns Jewish expressive culture and things like music and art, either it sends it underground or it turns it into heritage, which is often a kind of heritage in heavy quotes, which is often a fairly sort of pale version of what it's representing. So this is the context for Eastern Europe, for klezmer's heartland, you know, what's happening after the Second World War. And then we have the third part of the effect, or the third part of the influence. In 1948, all of a sudden, the Jewish focus moves from Eastern Europe, and arguably from the States a little bit as well, and it moves to the State of Israel, which is established in 1948. And with the State of Israel, we have a very, very different image of Jewishness. A new forward-looking Jewish identity, talking about pioneers, sabra, you know, these hard cactuses that are grown on the land and can survive. And we have sort of people, and particularly young Jewish men, becoming images of these sabras. Early Jews, you know, in Israel are soldiers, not victims. They're not these kind of pious Talmudic scholars, pale Talmudic scholars of Eastern Europe. They're kind of, well, they're the guys you can see here and the women you can see here. They're of the land. And this is obviously a very simplistic viewpoint, but you can get the difference between what's going on in terms of a view of Eastern Europe and a view of Israel. Importantly, in Israel, there was the decision taken that the language would be modern Hebrew and not Yiddish. And Israel, of course, comes with its own new music, Shirei Eretz Yisrael, the songs of the land of Israel, which are very much about the land of Israel and very much not about the Eastern Europe, ironically, from where many of the composers themselves had come. So this is these are the influences on Eastern European Jewish culture, which are happening at the beginning, which are happening after the Second World War. What did this mean for klezmer music? Well, it means it looks like this. If it comes to look like it looks like that. It slips under the cultural radar. It becomes about heritage. It becomes about Fiddler on the Roof nostalgia. It becomes about a very certain limited performance space, things like what was known as the Borscht Belt and the Catskill Mountains. It means a real dilution of klezmer music. Klezmer-im, which is the name for wedding music, klezmer musicians are as likely to be playing Latin lounge or selections from Fiddler on the Roof or light jazz as they are playing klezmer. And a klezmer musician becomes a vestige of the old world. This is a quote from at the bottom here from a man named Michael Wex, a Yiddishist Michael Wex, and he's talking about the Yiddish language, but the sentiment also applies to klezmer itself. And he writes, the trauma of World War II and the fragile triumph of our assimilation, that's talking about Jewish assimilation in America, meant that Yiddish, when allowed into public at all, was supposed to be a nod where we had come from rather than a picture of where we were. It was no competition for Hava Nagila. I think you get the picture there, I imagine. So this is where we're at in the 1970s. And what it means is that there is this kind of extremely unmotivated combination of nostalgia, invisibility, and preservation. And that's where klezmer music sits in the early 1970s. At the same time, in wider social and musical worlds, we have really a lot of energy going on from the 60s onwards. We have the arrival of kind of identity politics, or certainly the strengthening of identity politics in the civil rights movement and in increasing women's liberation. We have world music and world sounds entering into jazz. We have folk music kind of invigorating itself. There's Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger singing at Newport on the left there. We have an extremely kind of vibrant, wider popular culture going on, one which klezmer music, as it stands at the moment with its unmotivated combination of nostalgia, heritage, and invisibility, really can't match until the revival. Now, I'm just looking at time here. That's past. I might just do a quick straw poll. I probably have about another, well, I've probably a good 15 minutes or so to go if I carry on with everything that I had planned to say. How does that suit people? How are your energies? There's
I'd be happy certainly for another 10 minutes.
Okay, general nodding going on here. Okay, all right. Well, what we'll do then is I'll talk about the revival, and I won't necessarily play revival music. I'll bring it just a little bit up to date after that. Okay. But it's important to know what happened with the revival. So in the 1970s, we have a group of younger American Jewish musicians who are second generation Jewish musicians, or in some cases, third generation Jews. So they're either their parents or their grandparents were immigrants. And they rediscover klezmer, and they rediscover the Yiddish language as well as an important pathway to a newly politicized Jewish identity. So in the 1970s, with the revival, klezmer no longer becomes about a kind of integration into the norms of community life. It becomes about a kind of much more muscular, politicized identity statement. And as a result, it opens up a new musical horizon, because it's also often musicians who were kind of brought up within the musical foment of the 1960s and all of that kind of experimentation, and are now finding music that fits that experimentation, but speaks to them as Jews as well. And so what we have is klezmer music becomes new Yiddish music. It becomes radical Jewish culture. It becomes a part of world music. And it's more likely to be found on the concert platform and no longer almost exclusively Jewish. Now, let me see. Here's some early revival. We've talked about these people already. I have a little film here. I think I'm just going to play a little tiny bit of this film. This is an early revival band called Capella, who we've met once or twice. This man in the frame here is Michael Alpert, who's a great Yiddish singer and fiddle player, still very active on the scene. And let's just have a little bit of him talking, singing and then talking.
This is an entire world, you know, linguistically, musically, in terms of a way of thinking, a way of living, a way of dealing with life. It's, you know, in Yiddish to say a Weltele, you know, a little world. And it's the Yiddish world is an entire world which has been, in large part, other than in the immigrant communities here, and it was destroyed, was wiped off the face of the earth. And that's what makes, I think, Jews, you know, Ashkenazic Jews in the rest of the world, in America in particular, different than, say, Irish or Italian immigrants. Is other people have an old country to go back to. Our old country is gone.
So you can really hear there a sense of reclaiming of identity, which was absolutely fundamental to the klezmer revival. It is often fundamental to musical revivals more generally. And with this reclaiming, we have a change. We have a change in what's happening with klezmer music. On the left-hand side of this slide is what klezmer music was in Eastern Europe and in the early part of its time in the States. So it was strongly functional music. It was about reinforcing community values. It was, in the States, immigrant music. it was about a hierarchy. Remember, this was a dynastic, hierarchical musical system. It was closed, in other words, well, same thing. It was dynastic and a kind of caste system. And it was exclusively instrumental music. Now, with the klezmer revival of the 1970s onwards, what was function moves to art. What's about reinforcing community is actually becomes much more about music within leisure time, which is how we mostly are consuming music these days. It moves from being immigrant music to being music played by Jews who were born, I've written here, but here being the United States. The closed hierarchy of the klezmer capella in Eastern Europe becomes a much more democratic and open and freely available musical world. And importantly, it starts to include Yiddish song, which means that kind of political and aesthetic choices and statements can be made much more clearly because there are words involved. And I've got two revival bands that I wanted to talk about. I'm gonna very quickly just skim through the rest of my slides and see where we're at. I'm gonna ask David now. David, yep. would you rather I talk about the revival, these two bands, or talk about a little bit about my own kind of journey into klezmer? Because I probably shouldn't do both because I really will try your patience.
It's a difficult choice, but I think I get the feeling people would like to know a bit about your journey.
Okay, that's cool. Well. Yeah. All right, I can always send you some links to this. Oh yeah, I'm sure some of you will know these musicians anyway. Well, let's just look at this sum up slide then before I just do give you a little bit about my own journey. So where are we at now? Well, klezmer is a transnational music, and it really is transnational. It reaches from San Francisco to Japan and beyond. I know klezmer musicians in San Francisco who are in touch with klezmer musicians in Japan. Because there is not so much community transmission anymore, then we're much more reliant on certain important hubs of education and dissemination. One of the best is a month-long series in the heartlands of Germany called the Yiddish Summer Weimar, terrific concert and workshop series. Many of klezmer's finest contemporary practitioners are still strongly rooted in tradition, and almost as a result of that are actually able to stretch that quite considerably. For some musicians and for some audiences, klezmer music is a largely secular way to connect to Jewishness. That's definitely my own experience. And at the same time, there are many musicians and listeners who have very little cultural affiliation to the Jewishness of klezmer music. And klezmer music is one music amongst many. And we're all often, are very broad-minded in our listening habits these days. It's a genre that admits a great deal of variety and accompanying controversy, and nowhere more so than in Germany. And I might just get onto that at the very end. In which case I'm going to skip to here. I'll give you a very quick rundown of my own journey into klezmer music. So I got a classical training. I did all my grades at school and things. And then in my teens, I started playing blues and a bit of jazz and pop music. I didn't grow up with klezmer music. My parents, spoke the odd little bit of Yiddish that they'd got from their parents, but it certainly wasn't really a strong part of our household. When I was 19 or possibly 20 by this point, I was studying up in Sheffield Poly as it then was. And one of the guys I was living with was a tuba player, and he played in a street band. And through him, I discovered klezmer music. And I loved it. He described it to me as Russian Jewish folk music. And that, before I'd heard a note, that really piqued my interest, because I knew I liked Russian music from Russian classical music. I grew up in North London with really very little exposure to folk music, but I liked the idea of it. And I'm Jewish, so I was kind of intrigued at music which was going to push my experience of Jewish music beyond Hava Nagila and the stuff that I sang in shul once a year, and Fiddler on the Roof. So he introduced me to klezmer, and I absolutely loved it. When I came back to London, I started working with this clarinetist and saxophonist here on the left, Gregory Schechter. This is me in the middle holding a keyboard, trying to look like a new romantic by the looks of it. On the left here is our guitarist, Ronnie Goldberg. Ronnie was wonderful. Ronnie was paranoid that the tax office would catch up with him because he never declared any of his gigs. So if ever he did anything in public, he would wear a false moustache, this is what this is, glasses, which he didn't wear, and a big hat. And he, you know, we used to play around North London where Ronnie played all the friendship clubs. So he was very, very well known. And people would come up to him and say, "Hello, Ronnie." And he'd have this moustache and he'd say, "Who is Ronnie? I don't know any Ronnie." So I got an on-the-job apprenticeship with Gregory Schechter here on the left, who ran a terrific klezmer band. And we played weddings and bar mitzvahs. And I learned a lot of tunes. I also learned how to be in a band, be in a kind of working band, which is a very particular set of skills, I think, how to be a wedding musician, which I could go into a bit more detail at some point, maybe not now. Where are we at? Nearly 20 years ago, me and my partner moved up to Edinburgh, and I had no intention whatsoever of playing klezmer music, but it's, you know, you don't know what's going to happen, and music is one of those spheres that allows for a large degree of coincidence and unexpected collisions. And the forming of our band, Moishe's Bagel, was one of those lucky moments of musical cross connections. We actually, 4 of us, that's the 4 on the left, except for the guy holding the tabla, met in a tango band in Edinburgh, which we had all come to through our separate routes anyway. And we turned out that we all had a certain affinity for Eastern European music, and the tango band was run by a lovely Chilean singer called Valentina Montoya Martinez, and whenever she went out the room at rehearsals, we'd find ourselves playing klezmer music, and we thought, well, this is daft, we should actually make it a little bit more official. And so we started to form Moishe's Bagel. Now, Moishe's Bagel is made up of a classical fiddle player who plays with, until recently played with, the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. Me on piano, I'd say that what I mostly bring to that band is klezmer musical experience, although I have lots of other experience. Pete, our accordion player, is very much a folkie. Mario, the bass player, is a jazzer, and also plays a lot. He's from Sao Paulo in Brazil. He plays a lot of Latin American music as well. And Guy, our percussionist, plays tabla and darabuka, as well as his own slightly idiosyncratic drum setup. Now that brings a large amount of diversity, which I think is a musical strength of the band. It also brings its problems, diversity. You are kind of trying to stake your claim in a market, or, you know, a world music market that very much likes to put things into boxes. And I say this without rancor, I really understand it. If you're programming, you know, somewhere like St. George's or a festival, then you need to tick certain boxes. You need to say, okay, we've got something Irish here, we've got something jazz here, we've got something African here. You know, I don't think the process is exactly as calculating as that, but at the same time, a band that seems to do a lot of different things can be a very hard band to put in. But we're still here 20 years later, nearly 20 years later, and still enjoying each other's company, musical and social company, despite having got older and grumpier. And I think our fiddle player said it best recently when we were talking about this, and he said that we've kind of stopped worrying about fitting into anyone else's box, and we more decided to do our own thing and hope that there are people out there who have a box with whom it resonates. And so that's kind of where we're at now. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the questions if you like. There's us, I won't play that now. Okay, I'm going to sum up the whole thing and then we can have a little chat. So where do we begin? Klezmer is the traditional music, instrumental music of Ashkenazi Jews. Its roots lie in a mixture of local influence, so there's kind of Romanian and Ukrainian influence in there, and Jewish musical traditions, including to a certain extent Jewish musical traditions of the synagogue. Until the early 20th century, klezmerim were frequently family-based. In other words, this was a family business, and they traditionally performed for ritual community events. Migration and 20th century history have radically altered klezmer's social function and meanings, which we've been through in quite a lot of depth now. And since the 1970s, younger musicians rediscovered klezmer, which became known as the klezmer revival, although lots of revival musicians don't actually like that term. They prefer revitalization or resurgence. They argue that for something to be revived, it needs to be actually dead. Klezmer music is now broad in scope, geographical spread, and performance practice. We might ask if it's still Jewish, but then in the same breath, we might ask, does that matter? I don't know. I'm still undecided about that. And just before we go, I'm going to give a quick plug here. If this has piqued your interest at all, you can buy my book. So if anyone is interested in that, I can talk a bit more. Right. Thank you very much. I hope that didn't jump around too much, and I hope it gave you something interesting to think about.
Okay, well, thank you, Phil. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. It's not often that I let a speaker go on for 15 minutes longer, you know, to keep us entertained for an hour and a quarter. And, you know, as the organizer, I'm just particularly grateful that you actually did what I asked you to do, because I'd heard you previously speak at Limud with much more concentrating on the early roots. But yeah, I think the way you brought it up to date is excellent. So we've got a couple of people who want to ask questions, but do feel free to add others. Can I go to, and Yoav, can you unmute Norma Wilson? Norma, you had a question. Are you unmuted?
Still muted at the moment, Norma.
Right. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. And I missed the first few minutes, so you might have covered this. But could you say something about two aspects of the music? One is about its tone, about its scale, you know, whether or not it has any sort of influence that makes it sound so different. I noticed the music you showed had both a sharp and a flat in it. So in other words, no definitive key signature. And the other thing was about the fetching in the clarinet playing, what the history of that is.
I think, yeah, that's a pleasure. Okay, yes, I'll start with the scales. I'll get the accordion again, and then I can just take you through that a bit. So a lot of klezmer music is built, well, the two very characteristic scales of klezmer music have a raised second in there. Let me just, maybe easier just to demonstrate the difference. So if we begin with a scale that sounds like this. Okay, now we have a very kind of strange sounding second note there. If we flatten that note, we get this. I'm just going to change the register. Sorry, once again. Which has this flattened second and a raised third. So it's essentially, I don't know how musical any of you are. I'm sure you're all very musical. I don't know how much your musical literacy extends to, but essentially we're talking about a major key, but with this note in there. Now that instantly takes you into klezmer land, that scale. So that's made up of this particular flat second. The other scale that we can get from that same combination of notes, and that's the one that the music that I put up with the sharp and the flat in there, if we take that same combination of notes and move it down one, we get this. Which is where you get these kind of sounds. Which is also very characteristic. Now that technically is a minor scale, but has the same, has that same leap in it, which is a very, so those are they're not necessarily the keys that most klezmer music is in, and klezmer music moves around in its keys and its modes from piece to piece, but they are certainly the most two characteristic ones. So that gives it that sound. One interesting thing about that actually is that which is a final thing, and it's a very nice demonstration of what's different from Western classical music. If we take that first one again, this scale. Okay, now a conventional cadence in classical music is from like that. If we play this melody and try and cadence like that, it sounds, well, you'll hear how it sounds. Let me give you a little melody here. I mean, it sounds completely wrong. But what you can do, you still have similar cadences. You have endpoints, but we use different chords. So in this case, we would use something like this. So you still have a sense of finality in a musical phrase, but using slightly different combination of notes from Western classical music. The other thing I think you're referring to, Norman, you called it kvetching, but I think maybe you meant krechts. Am I right? Fetching is what my mother used to do to me when I didn't call enough. So a krecht it comes from very much from synagogue tradition, and that's that little like a chazan, a cantor. There's a catch in the voice, that sort of thing, and that certainly is the case in instrumental klezmer music as well. And it's essentially it's like a grace note, but the difference is the grace note is added to the note before, not the note afterwards. So you get this gap, which is a kind of gap in the sound. So let's see, let's have something like this. That kind of thing. And that's a very characteristic krecht sound. In something like Irish music or a lot of folk musics, that little grace note would go onto the second note, so you'd have that sort of thing. But in Jewish music, you have that gap, which is what gives it that kind of catch in the throat. And that's actually, a lot of people would argue that is the quintessentially Jewish ornament, the only one that doesn't really appear in other musical traditions. Does that answer your question?
Is that okay, Norma? I certainly learned a lot, yeah. Okay, Yoav, you wanted to ask about klezmer and jazz.
Yeah, Phil, you said that klezmer, when they came to America, wasn't particularly influenced by jazz, but I wanted to ask you the other way around. Was jazz influenced by klezmer? The obvious person you immediately think of is Benny Goodman, because he was a clarinetist and was Jewish, though I'm not sure he ever played any klezmer. The only one I know is Cannonball Adderley, great alto saxophonist, did a whole album called Fiddler on the Roof, which was based on the tunes of Fiddler on the Roof, but obviously with his brother Nat Adderley and the whole sort of jazz thing. So was there much interaction between klezmer and jazz? Were jazz musicians listening to it? Were they influenced by it at all?
It's, I think I would say in pre-war, not massive amounts. There was a bit, I mean, you know, the musicians are generally reasonably broad-minded, and certainly in somewhere like New York, you kind of have to be broad-minded. So there would have been awareness, but I would say that no, there wasn't a massive amount of direct cross-fertilization. So I think Artie Shaw as well did, you know, he was Arthur Shavin, wasn't he? And he brought some sound in. The clearest influence was from a trumpet player called Ziggy Elman, who took a klezmer melody, which is a bulga, and turned it into a song called And the Angels Sing, which went now and the angels sing, and it's the same song, but he made it a swing song. So that's probably the most obvious direct link. I'd say where it crossed over more is not so much in pure klezmer music, but in Yiddish song and Yiddish theatre. Certainly a lot of the arrangers who were working in Yiddish theatre were listening very closely to what arrangers for people like Benny Goodman and even, you know, Ellington and Basie were doing, and taking some of those in, because they had the larger forces going on with theatre orchestras and recording bands and things. So I think there was, you know, there was a kind of implicit effect, but nothing really obvious. But then just to finish that off, when you get to revival times, then no doubt a lot of the musicians who are klezmer revivalists are well schooled in jazz music, called structures as well, and vice versa. I mean, one of the finest early klezmer musicians is a man named Don Byron, who's an African-American clarinetist, and he's a superb, incredible jazz player, but got really bitten by klezmer quite early on at the Boston Conservatoire, and so, you know, incorporated that into his repertoire.
Thank you. Okay, Karen Singer, you wanted to ask about Phil's experiences on the road. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah. Hello.
Hiya.
You speak so fluently. I mean, it's I'm sure it's become part of you and your being, the klezmer. That's how it comes across. So you're just talking about your whole being. But what I wanted to ask you about is your experiences in different countries and what kind of receptions you've had, maybe something unusual that you've experienced that don't want to put you on the spot, but does anything come to mind particularly?
Yes, well, actually, maybe the most unusual thing was not in a different country, but with musicians of a different country. We played once in a festival down in Devon, and there was a Rajasthani band who were real gypsies in the finest sense of the word. They spent their lives on the road, and they had big pots and pans, and they would cook big curries wherever they were, and invite anybody who was part of their, you know, their immediate, like whoever was sharing stages with them, to come and eat curries. And we had a really interesting kind of cross-cultural mix-up with them, particularly because they also had a tabla player. So we have a tabla player in our band, and they had a tabla player. And these two tabla players were coming from very different traditions. And we certainly, the instrumental musicians, were coming from very different traditions. And yet we had this amazing, massive jam session, which I wish someone had recorded, because I think, you know, we were, maybe a drink or two had been taken. So maybe it sounded, we thought it sounded better than it really did. But I think it was pretty terrific. So that was probably the most interesting, the most unusual direct musical kind of confrontation. Playing other places, I mean, there's two answers to that. People do genuinely love good music wherever they hear it. I mean, I really do believe that. And it's a cliche, but a lot of cliches are true, that music is a universal language. And I think that you can take music to a different culture, or you can receive music from a different culture and get something from it without needing to know anything about it. Having said that, when we play in places like the Czech Republic or Poland, I think there's a certain familiarity with that sound world does mean that listeners react in a slightly different way than they might do in somewhere like Ireland, for example. So I think I noticed slight differences. But then, you see, I think it's slightly difficult to answer that from the point of view of Moishe's Bagel, because we do have stuff in our repertoire which is very traditionally klezmer, but actually we have a lot which isn't. So I think in a way it could speak to a lot of different people at once. I think I fudged that answer slightly, Karen, but I hope that gives you some idea.
It's very interesting, fascinating. Yeah.
Thanks. I noticed that Ronald has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, Ronald Mendel. Looks like your mic's on. So Ronald, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I want to take up the last very provocative question, Philip, that you raised. Is klezmer still Jewish? Mm-hmm. And that led me to think, do you or your band, when you begin to play, or at some stage of your performance, you actually talk about the Jewish origins of the music? You talk about what has inspired the particular tunes that you're playing? Because if you're doing that, you actually are communicating to the audience that it's still very much a Jewish form of music.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's especially interesting because I'm the only Jewish person in the band. So if anybody is likely to bring that up, that would be me. Partly because I've done a lot of thinking about klezmer music and I like to set things in their context. So yes, in answer to your question directly, yes, I talk about that, certainly, and always will set that in, and even try to set that within not just a Jewish context, but also the performance context that some of the music would have happened in. Like, for example, we play a slow horror, which would have been used as a processional tune to gather people along the streets for the wedding. It was a street tune, you know, so musicians would have played it walking up, leading the wedding party to where the ceremony was going to take place. And I often will tell people that. I think what's an interesting spin-off to that question. So I take your point. So in that sense, yes, I'm certainly acknowledging the music as Jewish. And I think in a way, there are different levels of affiliation for this and different ways that different musicians treat it. And I know most of the klezmer musicians who I am most interested in and like listening to, or, you know, most respect, do always acknowledge the Jewishness of it. And actually the Jewishness is a fundamental part of their musical aesthetic. And that's personally, that's the music that's the klezmer music that speaks most directly to me, not because of its Jewishness, but because I think that brings a certain thoughtfulness, which I think is reflected in the music. But what's interesting, I think, in our band is, because if I'm the only Jew, so I'm the most likely person to be bringing in that context. But other people find their ways around it as well. Our fiddle player, Greg, has written a beautiful tune called the Spa Shuffle, which is his version of his family's own journey. And his family came from Germany and arrived in Sunderland, and they were jewelers, and he found that there wasn't much call for people making fine, goldsmithery in Sunderland. But he tells his kind of family story, which is not particularly a Jewish story, but he's drawing on that same idea of heritage in the way that I might. So I think it has possibilities which are translatable across different experiences and different kind of ethnicities and affiliations, which I like. I think that keeps it very open-ended for performers, but also for audiences.
Thank you. Linda or Robert Hurst? I'm not sure which one of you, but whichever you are.
It's Robert. It's Robert.
Hello, Robert. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I'm hugely grateful to you, Philip, this evening, because you've just succeeded in the short space of time of transporting me and probably many more of us back to our roots. Because my grandfather was from the Ukraine, and I've always had a great affiliation with Russian music in particular, but also the fact that Yiddish is coming back even in Israel. But Israel is now accepting Israel as a good idea. Yeah, Yiddish is a good idea. And I think that all of these things are just coming around again. And I thank you for that connection. And the talk about feeling it being a Jewish thing, I think you can't escape it. It's so obvious. And I thank you for a very, very wonderful evening.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's very nice of you to say that. I really, really appreciate you making that comment. I think it's just to take it on slightly. I know from my own experience and also experience of friends of my age and my generation, it's a way of doing the same thing, maybe at one more remove. So we're talking about certainly not my father, not even my father's father, but his. My great grandfather, who I never knew. So we're talking about a slight kind of distance in the connection, but in a way, this is a way of making that connection stronger, isn't it? I think
there's some genetics going on there sometimes too.
There's some there's some genetics, but there's also some personal connections, and you can make those culturally, and they strengthen the personal connection, I think, for me. Yeah. But thank you for letting me know. That's really nice to know.
But one of the fascinating things is, I don't think your band is unusual. That the majority of the people in the band aren't Jewish, and yet it works. So yeah, and clearly you're. Can I ask Phil? Because it's only from your talks I realised that song, which seems such a prominent part now of klezmer concerts I've been to, that it was such a late edition from what you're saying, only in the 1930s. So where do people now, where did people then find the songs that they then incorporated into klezmer?
Well, the two things were existing in parallel. So where we began our story in the 19th century, early 20th century in Eastern Europe, there was Yiddish song going on, but Yiddish song was often, interesting, there's a gender distinction here as well. Yiddish song was often sung by women. There's this classic thing which you find in musical cultures, many parts of the world, is that often women are the singers because they're busy doing a lot of, looking after kids and cooking and doing a lot of other stuff with their hands. So whereas men have this time to be luxurious and instrumentalists and things. So this is quite a kind of common gender split that you find. So Yiddish song was going on, and it was being sung in the home, or it was being sung to reflect political or social or economic or kind of national concerns. So those songs were always existing, and it was functioning as folk song in the same way as we know folk song generally. It doesn't appear out of nowhere. Someone somewhere writes these songs and they get passed around, and people add their own versions on, and people take them into their own repertoire, and then at some point, the poor composer becomes what's known as traditional. Nothing's as memorable as a good song, and nothing's as forgettable as the guy that wrote it. And so this happens with folk song. But the interesting thing with klezmer and Yiddish song is the two traditions are in parallel. They're springing from the same cultural milieu, but they're not interacting, partly because of the gender thing, because klezmer is almost exclusively male, and partly because klezmer is functioning ritualistically. Certain ritual musical things are happening at chiefly weddings, but other kinds of events as well, which are structuring the events, and there isn't really place for Yiddish song in that. I think when you get to a much more urbanized population in Eastern Europe, in somewhere like Warsaw, but then more obviously in the States, and particularly in New York, where there isn't really room for those distinctions anymore, that's where we see it coming more and more together. And I think that, you know, the idea of post-war and in the revival context, it would be fairly pointless to try and maintain that distinction unless you were making a point. You know what I mean? A lot of the early musicians, the revival musicians, are excellent Yiddish singers, have grown up in Yiddish-speaking families, and not to include Yiddish in that point would be really cutting off their own noses, despite their musical faces. There wouldn't be any point in, you know, you'd be making a schism which is no longer there in the culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Finally, would you just like to briefly tell us A, about your book, and B, about the concert, hopefully in September at St. George's?
Yeah, sure.
Concert. Yeah.
Okay. So while I go, so there's two shameless plugs. We've been down to St. George's a number of times in the past and loved it.
Always. A lot of people in the audience have seen you in the past.
Yeah, it's been, I mean, it's one of our favorite places to play, and it's been very disappointing not to have. We actually had very little. When the pandemic hit, we had one very big thing in the diary, which was we were supposed to be touring Australia. And that didn't happen, which was a great shame. And we had very little in the UK in the diary because Australia was kind of crowding out the space. One gig we did have was St. George's, which was last March, and then got shunted again. With luck, we're going to be there in September. And this is playing some of our tunes, but also playing a soundtrack that we composed for a Soviet film, really interesting and slightly strange Soviet film called Salt for Svanetia. And this was by a Soviet director called Mikhail Kalatazov, who went on to become very famous, but this is his first film, and it has a kind of real experimental quality about it. It was made in the late 1920s, which is already in Stalin's time, so it had to have a tiny bit of propaganda in there. But we were commissioned about 5 years ago for a silent film festival to write a score for this piece. So we'll be performing that. It's very much our music, but there's a film as well. So I would recommend that one. And assuming, you know, everything crossed, then that's on September the 8th this year. If it's not, you know, we don't get there by September, Lord knows. And the other plug then is for my book. About 10 years ago, I was really happy as a musician, but we had our son was on the way. I wanted to do a bit less touring, and I had always wanted to go back into academia, which I never really kind of spent as much time as I wanted before. So I did a master's in ethnomusicology and subsequently a PhD. And my PhD topic was klezmer and Yiddish music in Berlin, which is a very interesting story. There's it's not, historically, it wasn't very prominent in, you know, pre-war, pre-Holocaust Berlin. Jewish community was largely westward facing, and the music they would have been listening to, you know, would have been Mahler or something rather than Freilachs and Bulgars. Since reunification, there has been an increasingly lively klezmer and Yiddish music scene in Berlin. And initially, that was largely, not exclusively, but largely driven by non-Jews in Germany. And this kind of raised a few hackles, because it provoked a bit of a level of sort of ideological hand-wringing. Essentially, people saying, well, what's going on here? Is this, you know, it's just some kind of weird cultural necrophilia. These are the grandchildren of the people who, you know, some of them are the grandchildren of the people who destroyed a lot of this culture. What's happening here? Now, the musicians were not necessarily thinking this way. This was the sort of cultural commentators who were adding this level on. But what happened is it created a very kind of vibrant and energized musical scene for klezmer music in the city. And so which still persists today. In fact, it's arguably more interesting and more exciting today than it has ever been. And there are a large number of Jews involved now and a large number of international musicians. So that's what I was writing about. And I interviewed lots of musicians, and they had lots of great things to say. And then I've tried to set this within the wider interesting and slightly troubled history of Jews in Germany. So that's what the book's about. If anyone is genuinely interested in buying it, please do get in touch, because it's an academic book. You know, academic books cost an arm and a leg, and I have a discount, which will at least mean that you get to keep your arm or your leg.
But would you say that you have aimed it at the fairly general reader as well? At
a general readership, yes, I would say so. I hope so.
Yeah. Any pictures?
There are some pictures, yes. Yeah, there's some bits, yeah. There's some music in there as well. I mean, some, sheep dots as well.
Great, lovely. Okay, well, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much, Phil. And if you want to show your appreciation either on gallery view, yeah, I can see lots of people tapping, and there's always the reaction button as well. But yeah, thank you very much. And Phil, perhaps if you can stay online at the end, and I can just have a chat to you. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was the end of our season, which has had its own challenges, but I think overall has been remarkably successful over Zoom. We're hoping that in September, October time, that we will be able to meet. People say face to face. I think with COVID, I think it's probably better to face side by side in the same room, but perhaps with some blended things. And at least one of our talks next year, I think it's the November one, is somebody speaking about the Jews in Mallorca, from Mallorca, including hopefully walking around the street. So as with so many organizations, I think we're seeing that some of the benefits of Zoom will last, and in particular the scope for getting international speakers. But we certainly, and I think the feedback I've had from most of you is that you are looking forward, where possible, to meet face to face as well. But whether we'll be able to have a screen and have people zooming in from other places at the same time, we're looking into it, and a possible change of venue to somewhere that be able to accommodate that. Yoav, anything else you wanted to say about that?
No, that's fine. I think we should let people go.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you all very much, and have a good summer, and we'll see you in the autumn.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, people are rapidly leaving. We do have a couple of other committee members who may stay on board as well.